attack him or attack the thesis.
Yes, that's right.
Now, what we're going to show you is not any of those exchanges, because we want you to buy the DVD and watch it for yourselves. But at the end of the debate, there was an opportunity for you to sum up and for Dawkins to sum up.
That's correct.
And that's the extract we're going to watch just now.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been an interesting discussion. I'll have to make my remarks very briefly. I do not think the answer is atheism, though I agree with much of the criticism that Richard makes of religion. I think the book, The God Delusion, gives the game away in the dedication at the front of the book to Douglas Adams, where he says, "Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too?" Now, you do a brilliant job at getting rid of the fairies, though it must be said that most of them didn't believe in them anyway. But when you see the beauty of a garden, say in New College in Oxford, do you believe there's no gardener or no owner? That its sublime beauty has come about from raw nature by pure chance? Of course not. For gardens are to be distinguished from raw nature by the operation of intelligence. And what you're doing in your book, I think, is presenting us with an obviously false set of alternatives. Either we take gardens on their own or the garden plus fairies. But they don't appear on their own. They have gardeners and owners. So does the universe. You say there's no evidence of God, and yet your very description of the universe as a garden bears witness that the evidence is all around you. Atheism, ladies and gentlemen, is not only false, it contains no message that deals with the central problem of human rebellion against God. History is littered with attempts to build a godless utopia, each one of them based, as the book of Genesis suggests that they would be, on a denial that God has ever spoken or even that he exists. And I would remind you that the world that Richard Dawkins wishes to bring us to is no paradise except for the few. It denies the existence of good and evil. It even denies justice. But ladies and gentlemen, our hearts cry out for justice. And centuries ago, the Apostle Paul spoke to the philosophers of Athens and pointed out that there would be a day in which God would judge the world by the man that he had appointed, Jesus Christ, and that he'd given assurance to all people by raising him from the dead. And the resurrection of Jesus Christ, a miracle, something supernatural, for me constitutes the central evidence upon which I base my faith, not only that atheism is a delusion, but that justice is real and our sense of morality does not mock us. Because if there is no resurrection, if there is nothing after death, in the end the terrorists and the fanatics have got away with it.
Okay. Thank you. Please. Professor Dawkins.
Yes, well, that concluding bit rather gives the game away, doesn't it? All that stuff about science and physics and the complications of physics and things, what it really comes down to is the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, there's a fundamental incompatibility between the sort of sophisticated scientist, which we hear part of the time from John Lennox, and it's impressive, and we are interested in the argument about multiverses and things. And then having produced some sort of a case for a kind of deistic God, perhaps, some God, the great physicist who adjusted the laws and constants of the universe, and that's all very grand and wonderful. And then suddenly we come down to the resurrection of Jesus. It's so petty, it's so trivial, it's so local, it's so earthbound, it's so unworthy of the universe. When we go into a garden and we see how beautiful it is, and we see colored flowers, and we see the butterflies and the bees, of course it's natural to think there must be a gardener. Any fool is likely to think there must be a gardener. The huge achievement of Darwin was to show that that didn't have to be true. Of course it's difficult. Of course it had to wait until the mid-19th century before anybody thought of it. It seems so obvious that if you've got a garden, there must be a gardener who created it and all that goes with that. What Darwin did was to show the staggeringly counterintuitive fact that this not only can be explained by an undirected process. It's not chance, by the way. Entirely wrong to say it's chance. It's not chance. Natural selection is the very opposite of chance, and that's the essence of it. That was what Darwin discovered. He showed not only a garden, but everything in the living world, and in principle not just on this earth, but on any other planet, wherever you see the organized complexity that we understand, that we call life, that it has an explanation which can derive it from simple beginnings by comprehensible rational means. That is possibly the greatest achievement that any human mind has ever accomplished. Not only did he show that it could be done, I believe that we can argue that that the alternative is so unparsimonious and so counter to the laws of common sense that, reluctant as we might be, because it might be unpleasant for us to admit it, although we can't disprove that there's a God, it is very, very unlikely indeed.
Well, that's to give you a sample, a taste of the debate, and I would encourage you to buy the DVD and to watch it. It's stimulating, it's thought-provoking, it's at times infuriating, and it's well worth watching. But what I want to do in the time we've got together, John, is to go back over a couple of what seem to be the key planks of the new atheists. What they seem to be saying is that the idea of God is something which was necessary or understandable in the past, but we no longer need it. For example, we don't need it any longer because science has an explanation for the universe, and we certainly don't need a God to teach us how to live moral lives. So I want to take each of those in turn. God is redundant. We used to have God to explain the origin of the universe, the origin of life, but now he's been given his P45 and he's gone.
Yes, and science, of course, plays a major role in this whole discussion. I think the first thing that it's important to remember is that science exploded in the 16th and 17th century in Western Europe. And the main thesis that's held by philosophers of science these days is that people became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And the great sinologist and also chemist Joseph Needham in Oxford was doing research on China, on which he was a great expert, and he was very interested in why, although the Chinese invented many things like gunpowder and printing and so on and so forth, why there wasn't an equivalent kind of development of science as we know it. And he traced it down to the very same thing. They lacked the unifying concept that comes through the biblical notion of a creator. Now, what you said is what they claim is that God may have been useful in the 16th and 17th centuries, but we don't need God anymore. And I think that rests on a series of serious misunderstandings, which can perhaps be best illustrated by the thing that's often thrown to me. You're a mathematician, you must know Laplace, the French mathematician. Yes, of course I do. And Napoleon was investigating Laplace's book, one of his books on mechanics, and he looked at all the equations and he said, well, where is God in all of this? And Laplace famously answered, je n'ai pas besoin de cette hypothèse. I don't need that hypothesis. And of course, when it comes to the level of explaining how things work, we don't need the hypothesis of God, because God is not an explanation in the same category as science. Let me put it this way. When Isaac Newton discovered his wonderful mathematical compression, the law of gravitation, he didn't say, right, I can now see how it works, I've got a mechanism, therefore there's no God. Because he was sensible enough to see that the existence of a mechanism is not an argument against the existence of an agent that designed the mechanism. And Professor Swinburne of Oxford, who's written some very interesting books on these things, he says, I do not deny that science explains. I postulate God to explain why science explains. And you see, one of the major reasons for my thinking that we don't get rid of God so quickly is a very simple one. It's that each scientist believes, before he or she starts doing their science, in the rational intelligibility of the universe. We can at least understand it with our brains in part. Now, here we have the two worldviews we were talking about earlier. What does atheism tell me? Well, Dawkins in the book, The God Delusion, says, of course, we can't think that the human mind would be terribly reliable, seeing the way it's been cobbled together by evolution. Now, you can take that a step further, because if we've only got matter and energy, and as he said in the extract we saw there, undirected processes, that is mindless, purposeless processes, that boils down to the fact that the thoughts in my mind are the result of the mindless, undirected motions of elementary particles in my brain. Well then, why on earth should I believe anything they tell me, including the theory of atoms? So that the atheist hypothesis undermines for me the very rationality on which the whole of science depends. Whereas the theistic hypothesis gives you a reason for trusting your mind in part and using it to explore the universe, because it's telling you that the same God who created the mind in here created the universe out there. So I want to say that far from God disappearing away from the situation, it's very important that we learn to distinguish things that differ. The categories of agent and mechanism.
Now, the whole topic of science burying God is, of course, what the book that you've
That's
written is
right.
about. And what you're seeking to do, as I understand it, is to bring someone to the point where they say, well, theism, the idea that there is a God who is responsible for all this, fits more comfortably with the evidence and with science than the other explanation.
I think you put it better than I do in my book.
Well,
that's exactly right.
But having got to that point, you stop.
Yes.
So that your book could be read and perhaps accepted by someone who was not a Christian, but who was a theist, someone who was a Muslim, someone who was Jewish, someone who believed in a God who was responsible for the universe.
Yes, that's right, because the primary battle is atheism against God. There is no God. And science has buried him. So what I want to do, first of all, that book's just a start. I'm writing another one.
Okay.
And that book is to bring people to the point, that is, if they follow the logic of it, to see that the explanation, if I might put it in biblical terms, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, or more precisely, in the beginning was the Word. There's a logos, there's intelligence, there's information, and all things were made by him. In other words, intelligence, an intelligent mind is primary, and matter and energy are derivative, that by far and away is intellectually superior to the view that says it's the other way around, that matter and energy are primary and intelligence is derivative. That is the first step. But just at the very end of the book, I raised the question, and it's left as a question. This is a platform for which we might then begin to claim, to study and think about a massively greater claim, in a way, that the Logos actually visited our planet and that Jesus Christ is that Word become incarnate. And for that reason, I am writing a second book which deals with not only the science side, but the whole palette of arguments that the new atheists are slinging against religion. And there I will be defending the Christian faith in particular, because of course I can't speak authoritatively for other religions.
Fine. Well, what I want to suggest is that those who are interested in the debate between science and theism really should buy your book and read it.
Well, I would accept your recommendation.
Okay, so that's what I suggest. And what I want to do then is to move to the next issue that these four horsemen raise, which is not just that science has buried God, if we have dealt with that, park that, but that the idea of a God, some sort of heavenly policeman, was something which was useful in the past. But now that we have matured, that we have come of age, that we no longer need God to be moral, we don't need a God to tell us how to behave. We can work that out ourselves. Aren't they right? We don't need God to be good, John.